of African people. I was asked to do an analysis of the role of African American men, or just of African men, under European imperialism. And I found that, of course, a very interesting and challenging topic. However, I decided I would sort of modify that a bit and not get too deep into that subject matter, for the reason that I think we need to sometimes review some basic concepts, because often you can get so involved with specific problems and issues, we sort of fail to see the forest for the trees. And we get caught up often in dealing with symptoms instead of the basic problems that confront us as people. So I sort of want to look at it at white imperialism and black self-annihilation, which covers the same issue, as a matter of fact, because to a good extent, the role of black men and the role of African people in general is basically one of self-destruction under the European imperialistic system. But I think it becomes important that we become a bit more concept-oriented in terms of dealing with the issues that confront us, and perhaps a little less symptomatic oriented, or looking at symptoms. One of the things that I'm dealing with now as I work with my next book on the education of black children is what we call cognitive styles. We have to deal with cognitive styles. And I did quite a lengthy section on that. And you know, you run across this business of many of our children having problems with what we call conceptual thinking and abstract thinking. Even basic issues of dealing with two or more facts in the mind at the same time and solving problems by coordinating those facts and relating those facts in various ways. I'm dealing with that because often the concept, the idea of our children having problems in thinking skills is dealt with purely academically. I am putting forth the contention that the problem of abstract thinking that we find in many of our children is essentially political. We must recognize, of course, that thinking is a power. It is not merely a skill, because this is what the European-oriented system tends to make us think when we talk about intellectual skills or academic skills. But these are powers. The scientific method is a way of thinking. It is a way of relating to the world. It is a way of organizing the world. This is a way of confronting the world. When that way of thinking became a tradition, you saw then the civilizations that engaged in it and that had the economic and political systems to support that way of thinking rapidly moved into technological and scientific development, per se. So therefore, thinking is not merely a skill, it is a power, which means then that those nations who want to keep other nations weak want, of course, to keep their thinking weak. And thinking in terms of concepts is an extremely powerful way of doing things. It has many, many benefits. Thinking abstractly is a very dangerous way of thinking in terms of European imperialism, which is one of the reasons why our children are going to have problems doing it. I've often told you before that whatever way of thinking and behaving and relating ultimately threatens European dominance you will find our children and our people having problems in those areas. And of course, I won't go into what we mean by abstract thinking, but a hint would be to do some abstract thinking, of course, means to not be diverted by irrelevant information, to abstract, to draw form from, to draw the essence of, to look at the defining characteristic of a set of phenomena, to look at the unity, a commonality that explains phenomena that on the surface appears to be different and not related, you see. And therefore, a concept saves a tremendous amount of time because it can create a unity where at first there appears to be none. And it can see the sameness in things that appear to be very different. It permits the individual then with one simple formulation or one rule or law to deal with many and varying types of phenomena and not be deceived by each new variation of the same thing. It permits thought then to be continuous. And it means that the individual is not deceived or is less deceived by appearances. Because to abstract means to see the constancies in the midst of variations. And of course, this kind of thought is very important to us because one of the things you must recognize in terms of European imperialism, that the same game will go on and on and on again, but there will be different shades and different appearances, so that those people will take the different appearances for real substantial change. In other words, we deal with the situation that the French are famous for defining: the more things change, the more they remain the same. Those people who cannot see and abstract and cannot conceptualize things which appear to be apparently different are people who are characterized by discontinuous and disconnected thought. And each event appears to stand on its own and often unrelated to every other event. And often they are subject to great confusion. And again, are subject to being deceived by a mere change of appearances. So you can see then an empire that depends upon deception. And you remember I have said many times before that these 10% of the world's population cannot rule the other 90% of the world. And European is 10% of this population and becoming less. This small percentage of people whose lands do not contain the world's wealth can only then be the world's wealthiest people and most powerful people only by deceiving the other 90%. That's the only way it can be done. The other 90% has to believe lies. And the greatest symptom that we have today among non-white people is the belief that they're believing in lies, taking lies for truth and truth for lies. And certainly you do not want to equip that people with the capacity to differentiate between the two. And this is what you see in your schools, you see. And this is why you don't see our children being taught this kind of thinking very deliberately and very consciously. This is why it is projected that this kind of ability is supposed to just occur naturally and innately, and is tested by IQ exams and so forth. And when our children don't demonstrate it, that's supposed to be some indication of their innate inability to think abstractly, which it is, of course. But I like to think of abstraction on another level, in a different context. To say that you are an African is to state an abstraction. you see. And it's a powerful abstraction. That means that you are now saying that the national origin, the cultural differences, the tribal differences, and other kinds of differences are irrelevant to the fact that we are African people. We are abstracting out of all of these differences that we can talk about an essence. And that essence is our African descent and our African commonality. And this is not an intellectual game, because when you make that abstraction, and all of our people from these different cultures and tribes and groups operate in terms of that abstraction, you have what? Power. You have a collectivity. You are now in a position for people to behave in a united way. You are now in a position for our people to unite in opposition to their oppressors and not to be scattered by them and divided by them and conquered in their division. And this is why I think in a more fundamental way, the ability to abstract must not be developed in black children. Not just for, academic. In fact, the academic problem is secondary to the political one, because we do not think in political abstractions, and we do not think of ourselves first as Africans and then see the connectedness of all the other things to that. We see this reflected in the academic area too. That is, the inability to operate on the abstraction of our Africanness is reflected in the classrooms when it comes to scientific and technological thinking and organization. You see? Because once we begin to identify ourselves as African people and operate on the basis of that Africanness, you will see our technological development take off, our scientific development take off, our political development take off. All Bush has to say is that we are American, which is also a what? Abstraction. And look what he's able to do by using the word what? American. Of all of these different races and ethnic groups and cultural groups and what have you on this continent, the use of the word American focuses their consciousness in such a way that he can now get them united to act even against their own interests. And he can get them now to behave in a patriotic manner by using the abstraction, American. At this point, we're not supposed to think of ourselves as blacks, whites, or this or that. Because people know, if people think in terms of those divisions, I heard a white lady calling up the other day to Bob Grant. I'm tired of hearing this black and white stuff. We're all Americans. And it's very convenient, of course. You can understand her psychology. You are American now because we need you to fight for us. You see? It's just like when we go to the Olympics. It's the American Olympic team, even though you have all these blacks out here. You see? And you can then activate our people in terms of this abstraction. So let's look then at white imperialism as a concept and see what that concept implies and sort of diverge a minute from the symptoms of white imperialism. Because when we look at the symptoms, we get caught up in symptomatic relief, but not in the cure of the disease. One of the reasons why we are caught up with the problems we have today is that we have people fighting symptoms over and over again and not facing the root of the problem and the real root cause of the symptoms. You can react then to a problem in terms of the root cause or in terms of the symptoms. And we make a differentiation in abnormal psychology then in terms of these two approaches, in terms of what we call a task-oriented response and a defense-oriented response to stress or to a problem. Of course, it's implied by the word, a task orientation implies taking an objective look at a problem and appraising it objectively and solving that problem or preparing to solve it by rational and constructive means and by conscious means. You see? Looking at it for what it is. Holding one's emotions in abeyance for a while and checking out the problem. And then deciding in a very rational way how that problem is going to be solved. And it's very important that we make that distinction. Often then the solution from a task-oriented point of view involves a change in oneself or in one's surroundings. I often differentiate between the nationalist and the assimilationist, the integrationist. As one whose face is outward and another that face is inward. In the sense that often the assimilationist sees the persuasion of white people as the most important solution to the problem. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later on, the changing of the attitudes as a solution to the problem of our people, or the changing of white folk in one way or the other. I think one of the principal orientations of the nationalists, though, is to look at internal change. A training of one's own people, a teaching of one's own people, and transforming of one's own people. We often talk about how we have been created by whites and been created by an imperialist system. But we must remember also, ladies and gentlemen, that whites are our creation as well. In the end, this world must be backwards. We must be backwards as a people to be in the condition that we are in. If we are to take lies for truth and truth for lies, that means then we have to be backwards in our orientation to the world. Because to a good extent, a lie is a reversal of the truth. See? It means then that the whites are dependent on us. We are not dependent on them. The imperialist is dependent upon the subordinate populations, not the other way around. However, the subordinate populations must perceive themselves as being dependent upon the imperialists. Japan has no natural resources to speak of whatsoever. It gets all of its raw materials and everything from outside itself. In straightforward terms, you would think then Japan should be a poor nation. It only survives because of its consciousness. And it's interesting to see how conscious they were about what they were doing. They knew that they were dependent upon their suppliers. Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, name them, one here and one there. And they said, how can we turn our dependency into independency? How can, in a sense, we make those we depend on, what? Dependent on us. And they worked that game on the people on whom they depend. The slave master depends on the slaves. But the slaves must think that their life depends on the master. What am I saying then when I say that? I'm saying then that the whites cannot be what they are if we are not what we are. And that if we can now engage in self-transformation, we will of necessity transform the world. And therefore we don't have to concentrate all our time and energy on trying to persuade whites. We must concentrate our time and energy on self-transformation. It is no way that African people, after having engaged in self-transformation, cannot transform the world. It is impossible, you see. And that's where we must focus. And therefore, if we are a task-oriented people and look carefully at our problems, one of the methods we would use, first and foremost, is that of transforming ourselves and in the process transforming our surroundings. Our actions may be overt and covert. Sometimes they will appear to even be retreating, but in appearance only. Sometimes it would involve direct attack, and other times it would appear to involve compromise. It's one of the things we don't talk about much as a people, strategy. You see, strategy. Strategy is against tactics. We need to talk about that more. We need to study military history. It's very important that we study that. Retreats can effectively defeat armies. No, it's not all, war is not all about, Mr. Man running straight forward toward one's enemy. It could involve backing up, stretching an enemy's supply lines, stretching their morale, putting pressure on their morale. It could be a matter of staying out of their way and prolonging the war so that back home the political and social conflicts will begin to create problems. And there's a collapse then in terms of the original country. And in a sense, you literally defeat the army without even fighting it. Hussein is playing that kind of game to a good extent. If we can keep you in here 4 and 5 months, because we know your psychology, you're an instant-oriented people. You want to win in one day. You've been raised on TV shows where problems are solved in 30 minutes. You have the Rambo mentality, you see. And, or you got racial and ethnic groups that are at each other's throats. You're in a political and economic chaotic situation. And therefore, the longer I keep you running and working, and you're spending $1 billion a day, and the longer I keep you just running after me, at some point, you're going to collapse from the inside. So then, a great general often uses retreat as a method of war, or guerrilla tactics as a method of war, you see. And it becomes important to us then to recognize that we can use all of the tools available to us as long as we know where we want to go as people. When I develop my organization, I tell people I look for Uncle Toms. Yeah. I want Uncle Toms. I want them to sit right there, and I want the white folk to trust them, implicitly. Because I want them to do what? Push out that information. Give you the intelligence. Some people may have to die with a bad reputation, having the populace thinking that they were traitors because they had to stay in a position to reveal important information so that the people could ultimately win. This is the kind of game that a task-oriented people can be about, that the task-oriented individual is about. You have the other type that is defense-oriented, who's basically concerned with controlling his psychological image or dealing with his fears and anxieties or trying to defend his ego or his self, trying to deal with his pain, but not the problem. And to a good extent, a lot of the kinds of struggles that we are in today are defense-oriented struggles, more concerned with defending our egos and stroking our egos and building our images rather than solving real problems. And you can see this in drug behavior, black-on-black violence. All of these are defense-oriented behaviors, people trying to deal with pain, people trying to deal with frustration, but with the pain of frustration, not with what? The source of their frustration, but with the effects of it. The source of the disease continues to destroy and eat them up as long as they don't feel the pain of the disease. They may think they have solved the problem that's confronting them. That's very dangerous. That's a neurotic pattern. And it's a neurotic approach. And if you look carefully, you'll see that approach being used much too much. Often the individual who's caught up in a defense orientation is one who achieves a reduction of pain by a denying of reality, by a distorting of reality, by a narrowing of his mental field. And when you look at the cognitive styles, again, of many of our children, the thing that is often remarked about is the fact that the focus is narrow, almost tunnel vision. And this is part of the problem when people cannot hold two or more facts in their mind at the same time and operate with those two or more facts. One thing at a time. And as soon as they get through dealing with one thing and move on to another, they forget the first one. I used to deal with my students in terms of their reading, sometimes the psychology text, and how they would read one sentence, and when they moved to the next, would forget the last. And I tried to indicate to them that in reading this situation, you read the first, you must hold some of its essence as you go into the second to see the connection between the first and the second. And while you're reading the second, you must also be involved in what? Anticipating the third. And then relating the whole thing to the context, to the section that you're reading, to the chapter that you're reading, to the book that you're reading, to the whole political social context in which you exist. Otherwise, comprehension is very narrow. But when many people, when reality has been associated with pain, disappointment, shame, fear, and guilt, and of course this is the essence of power, you see. The essence of power involves the ability to associate pain or pleasure with many things. The European then, having power, means that he can make it painful for you to say, I am an African, which is one of the reasons why many people don't say it. You'll lose your job. You come in here dressed like that, we can't hire you. No, you're un-American. You're not going to get promoted. We're going to laugh at you. You know, all kinds of little what? Pains. Africans have no culture. They have no history. They ruled by Tarzan. You know, so you attach what? All of these things. Pain, shame, guilt, so forth. And it's no wonder then a lot of people don't want to what? Say it. They don't want to have anything to do with being African. They don't see anything to be gained by it. They see what? Suffering connected to it. And so again, you see, as Freud projected very clearly, people are basically motivated by the pleasure principle. They're basically motivated in terms of avoiding pain, first and foremost, and seeking pleasure. And therefore power involves, and you can get people then to do anything if you have the power to associate pain or pleasure with various things. And therefore, if you can associate pain and displeasure and anxiety and guilt and so forth with anything having to do with African liberation, then the people will what? Avoid it. Escape from it like the plague. And it's so difficult then to get so many of our people to come to enjoy the sheer pleasure of thinking. You know, the beauty of reading, the fantastic eroticism of reading something wonderful and challenging. Yeah, when you ask them to read, it's almost like consigning them to hell. You know, laying a burden on them. When you say, you know, you finish the class and they get the question wrong, what is the answer? Look it up. Oh no, we don't want to look it up. That means we got to think and search, man. Tell us what it is. You say, yes. The white man in the South used to tell us, you're one of them smart niggas, ain't you? And we knew that what was coming behind that one. We learned that it was far better to be a clown. Keep them laughing and keep them happy. An extra tip for us. That the instant they realized that we were smart and we were too curious, asked too many questions, understood too much, then we knew the pain would follow. And therefore many of us learned to be dumb. We feel safe being dumb. And now many of us practice it with a vengeance until too many of us have identified it with being black. And we get kids then who, when they think and when they read and when they study, are called white and are accused of acting white and are called nerdy and this and that, and they suffer again. People with perfectly great brains and minds who just literally refuse to have anything to do with books and knowledge because they fear the social ostracism that will follow therefrom. And this is a part of the issue that we face today when people become symptom-oriented. When you get caught up in your symptoms, you become ego-centered. Because the whole point of being defense-oriented is to defend one's ego. And then one becomes preoccupied and consumed with checking out everything going on in the world in terms of what it means to their ego and self-image. You see? And anything that goes on is going to be evaluated in terms of maintaining the self-image. And ultimately, it's going to be dealt with in terms of avoiding pain and achieving some pleasure. The person becomes symptom-centered, hypochondriacal, concerned more with the movement of their bowels and everything else than with the reality of their disease. What are we talking about here then in political terms, the social terms? Racism is a symptom of white imperialism. And we get preoccupied with it, don't we? We're going to talk about it a bit later. Injustice is a symptom. You see people out there saying what? No justice, no peace. And they go case after case after case after case. Their whole life and organizational energy is spent protesting cases. Another group takes housing and the homeless. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, ladies and gentlemen. Certainly one has to deal with symptoms. But I'm talking about where one gets so preoccupied that he never gets around to the basic cause. So at first, our symptom was fair housing. Today, our symptom is what? Homelessness. We don't care where you put us and where we live. Just get us a house and get us out the cold at this point. Before, we want to live with white folk. Now we just want to get in somewhere and be warm. You know, so I guess they showed us that one. Okay, you're going to see your problem is deeper than that, then. You're going to burn you out in New York and burn you out in Newark and raise your rent and jam you up to such a degree until you're going to forget about trying to live with white folk. You're just going to try to get somewhere to keep warm. And now all of your energy is going to be concentrated on trying to come out of the rain, get out of the cold. Yeah. And as soon as you solve that one, I guess you'll get back to fair housing again. And then we'll go through the homelessness again. Yeah. And that's what happens when people become symptom-oriented, you see. They become preoccupied with dealing with the symptom. And you can look at it again and again. Segregated hospitals, right? Now we got you can go to any hospital basically you want to. That's the problem, still getting sick and dying. Black lifespan is still what? Growing shorter. People are still being overrun by diseases that we even thought were defeated. Tuberculosis on the rampage again, gonorrhea, other sexually transmitted diseases, AIDS, all kinds of things where other populations have literally reduced and almost eliminated them are now just striking back in the black community with a vengeance. But weren't our access to integrated hospitals supposed to solve that? Or the ability to be treated and come through the white doctor's front doors, wasn't that supposed to solve that issue? Now we talk about our children not reading, not writing, not thinking, not doing math. But wasn't that problem supposed to be solved by putting them in front of white teachers and having them sit in the school with white children and busing them from one side of town to the other and placing them in magnet schools and special programs and all the other crap that we say? What are we complaining about today? Now we'll chase another symptom. In the meanwhile, our children will die educationally. Fair employment, what's our problem? Unemployment, joblessness. And we can name what? One right after the other of the problems that we dealt with as symptoms, and we will see what happens. When you think that you have dealt with a symptom, it often appears what? In another form. In fact, after a while, the symptom itself, and being symptom-centered, itself becomes a disease, and itself becomes a cause of problems. When the individual becomes symptom-centered and caught up with just dealing with the effects of a more basic problem, the mental field is narrowed, the person's vision is narrowed, their capacity to see the connection between a whole set of things is restricted, you see. Little learning takes place there because they do not see connections. When they become caught up with mere avoidance, they don't learn what they could learn by staying and confronting the situation and dealing with the situation. Being symptom-oriented then in itself creates ignorance, reduces coping skills, reduces intellectual and organizational skills and political skills. It alienates the person from their own self-healing powers and from self-knowledge. And it alienates them from a knowledge of the fact that they have within themselves the power to solve their problem because they're preoccupied with the symptoms of the problem. So consequently, you have what we call in abnormal psychology the neurotic paradox. The tendency to cling to established coping patterns, despite the fact that they may be ineffective and self-defeating, and brings them continuing dissatisfaction and unhappiness. And we look over the history of ourselves as people, and we see this paradox occurring again and again. And we see our people using the same old methods again and again, praying on the Capitol steps, marching around, singing, praying, and carrying on. Some people tell me, well, you know, times really get hard, we'll wake up. I'm not too sure about that. I think we'll just back right up into those churches the same way we've always done, fall down on our knees the same way we've always done this thing, protest the same way we've always done it, and go through the cycle again until one day we're just annihilated and it's said and done with, and over. The paradox can be the neurotic paradox then, and this is the puzzle when you deal with neurotic people. You say, but you've done this before. You've been doing this, and it hasn't done you any good. Why do you keep doing it? You see, in neurosis, there's what people call a somewhat basic stupidity. It is as if the person can never learn from the same problem. I face this issue. I'm dealing here in my class with the issue of family. Statistics came out the other day that said the intact family with the male and the female and the two kids under 18 is now a minority institution in the society. In fact, it accounts for now only about a quarter of the types of families we have in this country. You know, many people won't face that reality, that this nuclear family is really no more in this society. And yet people orient themselves around it, they fall in love around it, and people will not stop then and question it and look at it. We just keep trying to do what? We just keep trying to build it. Instead of saying, well, wait a minute, maybe it is time for us to do what? Create and sanction a new family form. Maybe it is time for us to question romantic love as the basis for marriage. This irrational feeling people get. They don't know where it's coming from. They don't know what it's going to. They say they're blind, deaf, dumb, and crazy. That's love. And then they decide to do what? Get married and have children based on this irrationality. And they see marriage after marriage and family after family destroyed and falling apart based on that foundation. And children being destroyed based on this orientation and approach to marriage. But yet they get anxiety when you begin to question whether that kind of family is any longer viable for us as a people. And many will try to create it again and again based on approaches that are now questionable. Destroy their lives, break their hearts, break the children up because they refuse to question the foundations on which they come together as a people. Same thing happens if you look at education. When I deal with my class in terms of school, the first thing out here, if I'm discussing some problem, that's not the school's function. Who says so? The school's function is what? Anything we say it is. Yeah. We have the right to define schools. any way we want to define them. And when you realize that you have that right, you will see that many of the problems you think are problems can then be what? Solved. But it's only when you buy the definition of a school from Europeans and you take the idea that school is presently defined, is written in concrete, that problems become insoluble. You see? The same thing about family and many other areas of life. The African community has a right to define and legitimize any family form it pleases. And when we decide to do that, you will see that many of the family problems we talk about so much can be resolved and dealt with in many ways. You must recognize that words are not mere means of communicating one to the other. Words have social and political histories. You see, when you look in the dictionary and see the meaning of a word, that's all to it. That's what we call the lexical meaning, you see. But the political meanings are not there, but they are the most important ones. The word school, the word education, the word grade, the word achievement, all of those words have history. All of those words are developed out of the history of a people. It's the same thing when I talk about the time dimension and how a great part of our problem is African people. Their own and was not organically related to African history. And that's very important. When you change a person's time and time frame, you change their consciousness. You change their capacity to think. You change their capacity to relate socially in many ways. You change their capacity to remember, to organize themselves. Think about it when you're running late. Think about the anxiety. Think about the fear. Think about the state that your body gets in. Your heart and your blood pressure and the other kinds of symptoms that occur when you're operating according to what? Somebody else's what? Time. You see. When people rewrite your history, they are messing with your time. You see? They are taking your past. They are naming that past. They are characterizing that past, depriving you of that past. And being deprived of the past, you have lost a very important marker and point for locating where you are and for knowing why you are where you are and where you are going and how you got to be where you are. You've lost the capacity to think beyond the present moment and to connect past with present. And you lose the capacity to deal with cause and effect. And this is why our children also suffer in terms of technological scientific thinking. You see, there's a loss of identity. Now, one of the major problems we talk about when we talk about the education of black children, and I'm sure when you deal with the education of many of our people, is this present-orientedness, concerned with the immediate, being unable to motivate students in terms of your future. Well, you need to know this math because, you see, but if I can't see an immediate reward from it, I don't see any point in studying it. You say, oh, that's 4 years down the road. Oh, that's 10 years down the road. I don't need to deal with that now. I want to solve this problem tonight. I want these sneakers tomorrow. I want this Shirley jacket. I want this 8-ball jacket. You see, I'm dealing with trying to be popular in my class, being accepted, being the fashion plate. This is what makes me feel good. This is what makes me feel accepted. This is what gives me the sense of power. This is what gives me a sense of control over my environment. This brings me attention, admiration, and so forth. Don't bother me with the future. But look at what happens here. being robbed of the past, and under paternalistic racism, being robbed of responsibility for your future. What is it? White folk are going to solve our future problems. So what do you have then? A people thrown where? Into the immediate present, who are then disconnected both from the future and from the past. When one is solving problems realistically, one must solve those problems in terms of cause and effects, in terms of relationships, in terms of doing something presently so that one can create a future and not be victimized by it. But you must have a sound sense of relations and cause and effect kind of thinking. But people who are so caught up in their symptoms and relief of the symptoms do not develop these kinds of thinking skills. And therefore the neurotic paradox, that paradox where the individual, despite his suffering, despite his disappointments, despite his failings, continues to do the same thing over and over again, is the result of the fact that the individual is basically concerned with immediate relief from anxiety, and being focused on immediate relief and being focused on immediate symptomatic concerns has an inadequate perception of reality, and consequently learns very little and maintains the original behavior. And what am I saying here then, ladies and gentlemen, in a political sense? As long as we get caught up with housing as a central problem, you see, or even with education as a central problem, or criminal justice as a central problem, or white racism as a central problem per se, we're going to see that those problems will never go away. They will always just change form and shape, and we'll have to fight them in new shapes and new forms over and over again, and we'll make the same mistakes again and again and again. The African man has been struggling with the European now for the last 2,000 to 5,000 years. And when you look at a Chancellor Williams book or other books, you will see, and that book of course is about what? Africans making what? The same mistakes over and over and over again, right to the point of the Persian Gulf. A continuous line of mistakes, indicative of people then not having learned. Let's look then at imperialism, which I see as a root problem. When we talk about racism, remember, it takes a race to engage in it, doesn't it? Right? You know, most people kind of talk about racism in a disembodied form. You know, in terms of what? An attitude. Now that's one abstraction that works against us, doesn't it? Yeah. But racism has to be practiced by a race of people. And it's important that we keep that in mind. Why are whites racist? Because they have the power to be racist. Period. Now you can go into all kinds of psychological psychobabble you want to behind all of that. But that's the bottom line of it. They have the power to be. And when you get through explaining all of their psyche to them, you know, and going through all of your changes and trying to stroke them with guilt and bring them into confrontation with their constitution so they can live out their creed. When you get through with all of that and whining and complaining, about how he mistreated you and hurt you and made you all kinds of, whatever you complaining about. In the end, he'll just say, yes, you're right. So what are you going to do about it? You find yourself right back in the same shape. What are you going to do about it? Yes, I kicked you and colonialized you. Yes, I enslaved you. Yeah, I'm sending your boys to Saudi Arabia. Yeah, I'm going to make them fight and shoot and do all the things. Yeah, I'm going to make them kill each other out in the street. What are you going to do about it? We want to change your attitude. You could change my attitude. You might change it for a minute, but when I feel like it, I'm just going to flip right back into it. What are you going to do about it? But see, it's easier for us to pretend that it's the attitude and, and get caught up in all of that analysis because we don't want to confront the reality of power. And we don't want to confront the reality that all of these problems that we complain about, homelessness, poor education, all of this, comes out of one reality, and that is the white man's ability to impose these problems upon us. And the solution being what? What is it? What is the solution? Abstract now, tell me.
Elimination.
To eliminate what?
Race.
That's one possibility. And it may be one that's necessary. It may be one that's necessary. But most of all, if racism flows from the power to be racist, then what must we eliminate? That power. We must neutralize the power. That is the bottom of all the rest of the crap. We would not be in the condition we were in if the white man didn't have the power to what? Put us there. We wouldn't be hollering about injustice, he'd be hollering about it. And all the other stuff. If he didn't have the power to be unjust. And yet there seems to be a refusal on most of our parts to confront the reality of that situation. And to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that if you are not about breaking the arms of the white man's power, you're just kidding yourself and you're going to suffer and you're going to get the suffering that you deserve. And I can tell, I can feel even this little tension right here. Every time I talk about power, I get this little silence. You see, because somehow our old biblical training and all of this other nonsense that we've been taught makes us think that power is a dirty word, but it's the only thing that keeps you alive. Power is given to man as a survival tool. It is not sinful in and of itself. One cannot protect himself or feed himself or plow the earth or do anything else without what? Power. And without the ability to be aggressive. And somehow black folks sitting in these churches have been made to think then that it is wrong to talk about power and to cultivate power in a deliberate and conscious way. And imperialism involves then the power of one distinct group over another group, in essence to control the resources of that group, to control the political structure and behavior of that group, to control the authority of that group. White supremacy is just that. The supremacy of whites over blacks, and maintaining that supremacy through power, and using that power to the advantage of white people. George Fredrickson, in his book White Supremacy, defines it as referring to the attitudes, ideologies, and policies associated with the rise of blatant forms of white or European dominance over non-white populations. Another interesting book I think we should read in this context is one that's called Portraits of Racism by David T. Well, and I like it because it's very straightforward and doesn't get into a lot of psychological mumbo-jumbo. According to David T. Wellman, that's the name, racism can be seen to systematically provide economic, political, psychological, and social advantages for whites at the expense of blacks and other people of color. Keep that in mind. I want you to keep that in mind. Because we kind of forget. We talk about racism and slips off our tongue so easily, you see. But you have to remember, racism is not merely an attitude. It is a system. And the point of that system is to give material and non-material advantages to the race that is empowered to practice it. Dr. Wells has put out a nice little book here, The ISIS Papers. Interesting material there. Intriguing explanations. Psychoanalytic. Genetic explanations. That's good. Thank you. No problem there. Thank you. But often when you explain a problem, try, if you can, to give an explanation that has in it an implied, what? Program. You see? A good explanation, and I'm not saying she does not have that, but a good explanation is one that has an applied program. It becomes interesting to say that the white man oppresses the black man because perhaps the white man sees the black man's penis as being larger. What kind of solution does that suggest? That black men shrink themselves? I don't think that's a viable solution. Or to protect one's genetic pool, that's a viable explanation in a way. Or that they keep us subordinated because they believe we have a lower IQ. But realize this, ladies and gentlemen, these whites are going to oppress us whether we have little penises or big penises. They're going to oppress us whether our IQ is larger or smaller. The issue then is not one of the discussing of IQs and discussing whether an IQ test is culturally oriented or whether it is really true that black men are bigger than white men, and hoping then by showing that they're actually the same size that then the white men will stop oppressing black men. Forget that. It is enough that white men get material wealth from oppressing black men. Power and what? Prestige from oppressing black men. Comfort from oppressing black men. We don't have to go into the underwear. We don't have to go into the jeans. Hey, I'm living well, and I want to what? Keep living well. And if that means putting my foot on your neck, that's what I'm going to do. It doesn't matter if I have no penis. You know, that's the deal. So, you know, it's good and it's intriguing. There's a lot to that and it explains a lot. But then at the same time, we have to keep focus on some things here. What is it? That racism provides economic, political, psychological, and social advantages. And it is highly unlikely that whites are going to be what? Persuaded out of those advantages by any attitude change or the The determining feature of race relations is not prejudice toward blacks, but rather the superior position of whites and institutions, ideological as well as structural, which maintain it. I'm going to run through here because I swore that I'd keep in within time. Racism is more effectively analyzed then as a strategy for the maintenance of the privilege rather than as prejudice. I've talked before to people about how in the future we're going to have what I call faceless racism. Covell, in his study of white racism, talks about meta-racism. When the racial attitudes of whites will not be readily apparent. They won't call you dirty names. They'll be nice to you. You can live next to them, sleep next, but you're going to still have the problem of trying to figure out why are we still where? On the bottom. Why, after all of this desegregation and, fair housing laws and all of these other things, integration of schools and the whole bit, are our people still down and out and suffering and on the point of annihilation? If we view racism as a culturally sanctioned rational response, and I want you to understand, a rational response, because a lot of people want to define racism as what? Some irrational, hate-filled orientation. You don't have to define it that way. Rational response to struggles over scarce resources. What are we saying here? There ain't enough for everybody. And I'm going to what? Get mine. And getting mine involves putting my foot on your neck. And I am thinking in perfectly what? Logical, rational terms. Period. And I am not crazy. I am not irrational. I am saying I want to feed my children first. I want to clothe my family. I want to stay out of the cold. I want other people doing all the hard work and the whole bit. And hey, both of us can't live this way. And I know who I want to live this way. Straightforward. Straightforward. But we refuse to deal with it that way. We refuse to deal with it in our own communities this way. Here we are unemployed as a people. And we are feeding other ethnic groups. It's not about racism. It's about the fact that our black men and women are unemployed. It's about the fact that the industries have left America and been shipped out of the country, so that the jobs black men used to have and women used to have are no longer there. They're just not there. The Ford Motor Company plants have left Detroit, and Detroit is suffering and falling in on itself. The Midwest is falling in on itself. What can we do? You see, again, we don't look at it that way. I'm saying to us as people often, we should think about just not buying any more Ford products. I'm not buying any more GM products. And say, until you put that plant back into Detroit or you do something here, we're not going to support your racism. We're not going to support what you're running on. But let's look at it more closely. Despite the fact now that these men and women have been bumped from these jobs, we still let other groups sit in our community and take out money by the tons. And our wealth is just sucked right out of the community, and it keeps the other people's children out of trouble, keeps them out of crime. We literally subsidize the other children and people, children of other people out of crime. We literally pay for the criminality of our own children. And we do it behind some crazy moral code. I don't see color. I treat everybody alike. That's the Christian thing to do. If you don't see color, then you can't see your own black children suffering. And not all children are suffering to the same extent. And when you treat them all the same, you're giving money to kids who don't what? Need it. And therefore, in a way, your moral principle supports sin and subsidizes sin and crime. Because the truly honest and moral person is discriminating in their giving and discriminating in their support. Non-discrimination is not a moral approach to the situation. Yet we let these churches deceive us into this kind of stuff and make us think then not to see color is the best way to go. And then we wonder why our children attack us at night and attack us during the day. Yeah, this game is on. Let's look at the resources. Either the Africans are going to have access to those resources on their continent, or the Europeans are going to have it. And the Europeans are not going to turn it loose in the name of any kind of moral principle, or constitutional principle, or any other brotherhood principle, or any other thing you're thinking about. They love the life they live too well. That's why Bush talks about the American way of life. And we're going to defend it. And that's why he's telling these Arabs, we want this gas, we want it at this price, we want to set the prices you sell it for, and if we have to make war on you and conquer you militarily or control you with the permanent army over there, that's exactly what we are going to do. A rational response, thought out objectively, not as a result of neurosis, but of saying, this is what we want and this is how we get it. We can account for it then for its widespread character, we're talking about the so-called racism, and avoid the inconsistencies and meaningless distinction that arise when it is viewed as prejudice. In other words then, we have to stop looking at racism as an attitude, but as a strategy for one race gaining a material and other advantage over a race. And we will see then, that is why when we make one move in one direction, these whites have a new rationale in the other direction to maintain us in the same situation that we are in. Whatever the nature of imperialism or white supremacy, they are consistently designed to exploit in some way the subordinate population. Why engage in imperialism if your point is not what? To exploit the subordinate population. It has no point then. Why engage in white supremacy if it is not to use and abuse and take advantage of the subordinate population? Imperialism can and does vary from direct military suppression, concentration camps, forced labor, slave labor, peonage, wage slavery, martial law, curfews, passes, religious conversion, desegregation, neocolonialism, tokenism, on and on and on it goes. But it has one constant. No matter what ism it is, it's designed to do what? Exploit the subordinate population. And you have to keep that in mind. But whatever form it takes, whatever evil it perpetrates on the subordinate population is deliberate and intentional. Whatever good it does is purely coincidental. Okay? Functional and tenuous. I say that for you Negroes who made progress. You know, who got some good jobs. There's no contradiction there. It's another form of neocolonialism. We give you a good job so you can help us what? Keep the natives in line. Confuse them. Deceive them. You're not made any gains. You're a part of the whole system. And when we no longer need you in those jobs, what are we going to do? Knock you out of them. A colleague of mine was talking to me about a bus driver friend of his who is now retiring, and he was trying to get him to understand how important adequate power was to his getting. Well, that didn't help me in no way. I took this test myself. He didn't take this test for me. You know, short-sighted like many of our people are. And now he's ready to retire with his Lincoln car, and he's going to California. He's going to lay back. You know, he just assumes that those pension checks will still come. You know, he hasn't thought about the possibility that these whites could say, hey man, you worked for us 50 years, so what? You're not getting any more checks. What are you going to do about it? Yeah, he don't think about that. He doesn't think about the fact that he is going to need power, and black people will need power to defend themselves against that possibility, which does occur. Freedom National Bank, guaranteed by the federal government. Okay, we'll be with you in a minute, right? Okay, well, hey man, we just going to give you 50 cents on the dollar. Go to the Bank of New England the other day, we're going to pay everything you got. Oh, what happened? Because we are able to do it, Negro. What are you going to do about it? Nothing. Yeah, let's forget it for what it is. We don't want to deal with it. So what you have and what you have gained under this system is purely tenuous and coincidental to its operation. It in no way means that it is permanent, nor does it mean it's going to stay with you forever and ever as in a fairy tale. It can be taken and used. Every year I try to review a little bit here, Lerone Bennett's book piece in the Ebony magazine of October 1981, where he talks about the Second Reconstruction. Because we've been down this road before, haven't we, ladies and gentlemen? What did he say? Let's read this to Julius William Wilson, to Thomas Sowell, to, what's the boy, Steele, Walter Williams. Let's read this to them again. It was at long last, over and done with. How could anyone doubt it? How could anyone fail to see that the race problem had been solved forever? Julius Wilson, writing about the declining significance of race. It's no longer a problem of race. We've heard this before, 100 years ago. You know, we weren't aware of this. This game went on 100 years ago. What did it say? One man had no doubts, who had no doubts said, all distinctions founded upon race or color have been forever abolished in the United States. Another who saw things this way said the category of race had been abolished by law, and there were no more colored people in this country. Thus spoke the dreamers and prophets and victims in the first Reconstruction of the 1860s and 1870s. So we've been down this road before, and we shouldn't forget it. And it is worth emphasizing here that at the very beginning, that these flights into fantasy were based on the same hard facts that gripped the imagination of blacks in the second Reconstruction of the 1960s and 70s. That is, these people who drag out the median income figures, you know, and the educational level figures and all the other statistics that indicate clearly that race is no longer a major variable to be dealt with in the United States. We've had this game before, ladies and gentlemen. What does it say? In the 1860s and 1870s, as in the 1960s and the 1970s, there were black sheriffs and mayors in the South. There was an open speculation about a black vice presidential candidate. There was, moreover, a network of civil rights laws that seemed to settle the issue beyond all possibility of dispute or recall. Free forever, weren't we? Back there 100 years ago, there was a federal law protecting voting rights in the South. Does all this sound vaguely familiar? And there was a National Public Accommodations Act. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, there was a law that said you could ride in the front of the bus in the 1870s and 1860s. Nothing new. Before Rosa Parks, there was a law there that was present then. Such, in broad outline, was the racial situation 100 years ago in the 1860s and the 1870s, when racism was forever abolished in America for the first time. That it was a short forever. So what are we talking about here, ladies and gentlemen, then? That progress, when the European and the white man still has power, still has ownership of the means of production, still has overwhelming military force and political power, is only tenuous and shaky and impermanent. It is never assured. They taught us that lesson in the 18th century, that progress, when the European and the white man still has power, still has ownership of the means of production, still has overwhelming military force and political power, is only tenuous and shaky and impermanent. It is never assured. They taught us that lesson in the 1860s and 70s, and it looks like we'll have to learn it again. So whatever progress we've made, it is only for a little while. Ultimately, under imperialism, the subordinate race must be recruited to make war against its own interests in favor of the interests of the oppressors. If the interests of the imperialists requires the self-annihilation of the oppressed, and I want you to keep this in mind because this is where we are now, then the subordinate population, or a portion of that population, must engage in the murder of another portion of that population, or must commit suicide. When I'm writing in the book Black on Black Violence, I'm writing about that. That's why I subtitled that book, Black Self-Annihilation in Service of European Domination. That is, when the European gets to a point where he has a death wish and wish that we were dead, we will accommodate him by killing ourselves as a people. Or one segment of our population will kill another segment of the population. This is the nature of imperialism. Why have imperialist power if you cannot bring this about? What's the point of it? It's not there for fun. It cannot be denied that individuals and segments of the subordinate race can materially prosper and gain high social status and some degree of power under imperialism. However, this neither negates imperialism nor indicates that it is withering away. Subordinate progress, that is the progress of the subordinate race, may indeed point to the fact that the imperialist power is what? Increasing. You understand what I'm saying? Your progress and your moving up in the society can be indicative of the fact that whitey is having a stronger hold over the black population than before, not less. And some of us want to read into then how electing mayors and governors has an instance of black progress and an increase in black power. It can indicate exactly the opposite, the weakening of black people and the increasing vulnerability of black people to death and annihilation by white. Because Deacons is not going to protect you if a white man comes to get you. And Wilder is not going to protect you. And old Colin Powell is going to lead the battle against you and destroy you. And he's going to have black men behind him and in front of him to do the destruction for him, as he did in Grenada and as he did in Panama, and as he's going to do then. What greater tribute to white power than to have a Colin Powell, a black man leading black men against black men, ladies and gentlemen. This is no evidence that the white man is softening in his racism. It is evidence that he's becoming slicker and more efficient in his racism. So don't come to me with your tales of working hard and your individualism and how your mama sat beside your bed and told you you could make it in the world. That won't get it. That won't get it. I get tired of these people. Well, you know, mama told me to work. Is your mother the first one told you to work hard? Are you the first Negro that came from a good black family? Don't come telling me it's your family that put you there. Black men, African people have been having good black families since the African man first put his foot on this ground. Black mothers have been telling black boys to make something of themselves and black children since time began. You are not unique in any way. As I tell college students, you are not here because your family was a good family or because you worked hard in high school. Black people have been working hard in high school since the very beginning. But at that time, it didn't matter how well and how hard you'd work. The whitey says what? You're not getting in here, period. And it wasn't your family that got you in there. It wasn't your hard work that got you in there. It was the collective power of black people. And it is the collective power of black people that will keep you in here. Not because you're making A's, not because you're passing. No way. It is the power of the race to protect your interests as a people, and you should not forget it. Your promotion and your individual promotion is not the promotion of the race. And the race should not be duped then into believing that the movement of one man, or the movement of one woman, or the movement and the promotion of one person here and there represents racial progress. Look at it very closely. Because you recognize what? We had black senators, and we had black representatives, and we had black governors, and we had all of this stuff in the 1860s and 70s, and we had to fight another 100 years to get back to the same spot where we are today. This is no guarantee of the black future. The only guarantee is power. And the only guarantee, black men, is for you to get your balls back together and decide that you're going to confront this white man and break his arm and bring his rule to an end. There's no other way to do it. Read that history. Johnson, Andrew Johnson, and Hayes, when they decided it was over, and they told the whites down south what? You can have them. Do what you want to with them. And what was the problem of power? Speaking of scarce resources, because I got to bring it to a close here. You tell your children, get an education, you can get a job. That's true. I'm not denying that. I'm not, working on that. I want you to think about something, though. Think about scarce resources again. And I've told audiences before, the whole business of black children dropping out of school is so politically convenient for Europeans. Think what would happen if we graduated in New York City, a majority black Latino city, 100% of our Latino black students. Does that mean there's a job out there waiting for every one of them? Not at all. Who says that? But we forget that, you see. And of course the white is going to say, well, you're not working because what? You dropped out of school. Well, ask them what would happen if, you actually finish. It's like those people that said, when we talk about other people owning our community and owning the economic, well, why don't you get your own stores? You really don't mean that, do you? Because if we had our own, how are you going to make it? That kind of statement is made with the assurance that you're not going to what? Do it. You see, and now they can get an ego trip off of you and work you if you don't know what's going on. And, and make you feel bad. If you looked in yesterday's New York Times, and last someone here documented what had been put forth some years ago, that the dropping out of our children is politically necessary to maintaining this system. That they must drop out. That's why you can never solve their problem. That's why whatever you do, it never appears to change the dropout rates. You see, because you must realize that dropout is necessary to this system because the jobs are not there. And because black people, we have not decided to take them from other people. Is that too immoral? Well, die in your morality. Yeah. You're sitting over here with the school system. You got a nominal board and so forth. And I'm sure you still got Italians and all other kind of people getting all the money out of the system. Yeah. You got to run them out of there, man. If you can't run them out in terms of tests, you got other ways of running them out. Strike that from the record. But look at this. Let me look just a minute. He said, and they did this series. Some of you who read last week's series in New York Times, they run these little cry pieces now about poor black folk. They run them for 2 weeks in the New York Times. Had 3 pieces here on January 27, 28, 29, called The Missing Agenda, Poverty and Policy. Basically crying, nobody cares about black people anymore. That's basically what they were about. But he says, you know, your series on poverty in America, while hitting most of the issues, missed the biggest one. Are there enough jobs for the poor? If the number of low-income welfare recipients, unemployed, and discouraged workers is less than the supply of available jobs, then either the conventional conservative solution, increased motivation by cutting benefits, you've heard that one, right? Or the conventional liberal solutions, so you got to go in both ways, remove barriers to entry, such as racial discrimination and lack of job training, you've heard that one too, may be sound as public policy. What? If there are more jobs than there are unemployed and people on welfare. If, on the other hand, the number of those who we expect to work substantially exceeds the supply of available jobs, then neither motivation nor the removal of barriers will do much good. What about that Thomas Sowell? Are black people unemployed because they lack motivation and the industriousness of Koreans? Let's check that out. It's an easy description. We hear people bring it up all the time. Is it the fact that there's still racial discrimination per se, and all we need to do is let down the barriers and engage people in job training? Or is the fact really one that says there are not as many available jobs, whether you have training or not? And now that calls for a different approach, doesn't it? Yeah. That's why I tell people it's more than running for the mayor's job. You run for that mayor's job, and more important than the mayor's job, you run for that controller's job, which blacks overlook because it's not high profile. But that's where the money is. That's why the Jews stay on that one. Think what happened. The federal government set in millions of dollars in the Bank of New England to keep it afloat. Yes. The comptroller of New York controls over $30 billion. He could have enriched Freedom National Bank overnight by just depositing some of the tax money and pension money right in that bank. It would have been worth $3 or $4 billion or $400 million right overnight by just placing it there. But no, we want to be mayor and leave the controller to the other thing. You run your people for office so that you can feed from the public trough the way the other ethnic groups feed from the public trough. But we don't run it that way. We just want images. And so if one man gets paid and the other people feel good. Most of the poor will remain poor because there will literally be too few jobs. And he talks about, when you look at data, if the data does exist, the supply officially of unemployed workers alone, not welfare recipients and others, exceeds the supply of unfilled jobs. Depending on the official unemployment rate, the number of officially unemployed and unemployed consistently exceeds the number of unfilled jobs by ratios from 10 to 1. Okay? Who are we kidding? This country has faced the fact that it's in the future, in fact right now, must literally pay people to be unemployed. That's a part of the outcome of automation and the other kinds of development. While any individual's poverty in the United States may be the result of inadequate motivation or frustrating barriers to entry, aggregate poverty in this country is the result of 2 simple shortcomings of the labor market. Too few jobs and too many jobs that pay wages too low. And often you have to make this distinction because many people will go, well, you know, I worked hard and I got through. But that is a personal interpretation. A statistical interpretation has to be dealt with quite differently. You can predict what a group does, even though you cannot predict what any individual in that group does. So you can find any individual in that group that differs from the group norm, you see. But that does not mean that the group norm is invalid. And people forget that, you see. And so we get some jokers sitting in the University of California, or sitting in Harvard, or sitting in one of these white schools, and he's got his way up there because he's going to be used as a token. He doesn't want to deal with that. And then he's going to claim that race had nothing to do with him being there. He was qualified to get there. Well, ask him why he wasn't there, before 1960s, or before the 1970s, or in the other years, if that was the case. So then, we'll wind it up here by emphasizing then, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that it is the nature of imperialism and white supremacy to take advantage of its subordinate groups. Imperialism and white power, by definition, require that the subordinate group works against its own interests. You have to understand that in depth. That the interest of the imperialists comes first. And that the use of the wealth and resources of the subordinate population will go to the ruling group. That's the nature of imperialism. And unless you can stop that, job marches and all this other stuff is going to get you some symptomatic relief, and it'll get a few people some jobs and so forth, but the race as a whole will continue to sink in the dirt. I was covering something here last week as I was writing, and just to talk about coding. There's a little passage, an interesting section in the Introduction to Psychology by Atkinson, where they differentiate the abnormal from the normal person, and they name a few things there. And it's interesting to look at the list. And I often tell our people, it's good to turn things backwards, and that whites often write in codes, And when they describe something in this program, and they describe, well, what makes a normal person different from an abnormal person, in general. And they list things like efficient perception of reality, right? You got to know what's real, deal with what's real, be conscious. Now that is also a program for driving people crazy, isn't it? What would you do to drive them crazy based on that definition? If to be sane is to have an efficient perception of a person of reality, what do? You distort it. You deny it. That's what the rewriting of black history involves. That's what the scandalization of the black personality involves. In other words, in this book, then, is a straightforward program for how to drive Africans crazy. But you see, if you can't read well, that's why reading has to be more than just understanding the vocabulary, right? You miss the whole point of it. And then the next thing it says what? Self-knowledge. The normal person has a greater knowledge of self than the abnormal. Therefore, he knows why he's behaving in a certain way, in ways, and the abnormal one, he doesn't know why he behaves the way he does, because he has no self-knowledge. You see, when you don't have self-knowledge, you then are victimized by your impulses, and you're a puzzle unto yourself. Why do we act like that? You see? Then he names what? Voluntary control. The normal person has control over himself. And then he follows that by saying self-acceptance and self-esteem, followed by the ability to form affectionate relationships, followed by the ability to be productive. Now, when you look at that in the light of imperialism, you can see why we're out of our minds, can't you? Right? Yeah, the very nature of imperialism itself cannot allow a subordinate population to have a realistic perception of reality, to have a sound what? Knowledge of itself, because to know yourself is to know them. Okay? Cannot allow the subordinate population self-control. The essence of imperialism is what? to taking of self-control away from the dominated group cannot allow the subordinate group to have high self-esteem, because you must justify their subordination and tell them that it is their role and destiny in life to be servants to other men throughout destiny, right? You cannot let them then form affectionate relationships. For them to love one another becomes the basis of unity and acting in unison and in common one with the other, and means that they can bring their collective power to bear. And when they are a vast majority in the world, they can overcome a minority in the world. So therefore, they must have serious problems in their capacity to form affectionate relations one with the other. You cannot let them be productive, because the very essence of imperialism means the right to expropriate and take from the subordinate group their products and their resources and so forth. So you know then the very essence of imperialism requires abnormality in the subordinate populations of the world. And the program is put right there and right in front of us. And this we have to understand, and this we have to deal with. And then it will become clear why we are killing each other, why we have health habits that are destroying our health and destroying each other. Then we can understand the role of the black male as he becomes a black-on-black criminal and attacks the black community and allies himself with the white man against the black community. We can see then that the black soldier is in line with the black-on-black criminal. He's in line with all of the other things because they're all rooted in the same foundation. Let's look quickly at Clinton Cox's piece here in the City Sun, which I recommend highly. I hope you're reading Cox's pieces. The best columnist out here, bar none, white, black, green, or yellow. Not filled with a bunch of opinions and nonsense and feelings, but research material that you can check and verify and see for yourself. And this is the kind of writing that the black publications need to do. First thing I'm doing on Wednesday morning is headed out to that newsstand for Clinton Cox, I'm telling you. And you can see why. Look what he says about the black soldier. Often the soldiers are black like their comrades. They are there to defend, he's talking about the boys in Saudi Arabia, the perceived interests of the United States and other industrialized nations. Until the breakup of the European colonial empires after World War II, that chore was performed by colonial armies. What is he saying? From the point of when you see the white men entering into Africa, the Romans and the Greeks, and ultimately the Arabs, you will see black men being transformed into soldiers for their imperialist masters, whether white or whether Arab. And you see it. And it's been going on year after year after year. Read Chancellor Williams. Often they use dark men to do their killing for them. This is the same killing, ladies and gentlemen, that goes on out here in the street as well. These boys out here killing other black men are in the same role as black soldiers killing other black soldiers. It's the same game. Don't be deceived. The United States has followed the same formula. That's conceptual thinking for you, isn't it? Get the formula. Take control of their minds. Rewrite their history. Get them to hate themselves. Get them to be unreal in relationship to themselves. Get them to have problems. And then you can get them to fight each other, destroy each other, and commit suicide. That's the formula. Once again, black Americans have gone forth under the flag of the United States to kill for what? White power. As they have done for how long? 120 years. We have not learned because we've been symptom-oriented. We've been ego-oriented. We wanted to win. We've been wanting to win the white man's respect through the killing of ourselves and the sacrificing of our life. Once again, black people are serving as the agents of imperialism for a nation that still despises them. And he goes back there and deals with the Civil War, the 9th Cavalry, the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers. Read the October 24th, 1990 piece there. I think you'll find it informative. Look at what these regiments did as they went out and destroyed Indians. As they were put 600 miles away from the nearest town or the nearest post so that they could be isolated away from the white populations, how they were not given leave, how they helped in the United States to steal the land of Indians while they were complaining about their 40 acres and a mule. We see the same thing going on today, again and again. The duties of the black soldiers were to prevent the Indians from marauding and to capture and confine them to their reservations, to drive these Indians off their lands, while blacks had no lands of their own. I wish we could have time to quote some of these situations here. The 7th Cavalry, a group of white men, were in danger of being overrun. They were rescued by black soldiers who had marched 108 miles through a blizzard to reach them. And these same black men are going to get hung and strung up when they finally get back home. Black soldiers seeking freedom for themselves had helped end the freedom of others. And he goes on to talk about the war in Cuba. And in what? The Philippines. Black men fighting other black men in the Philippines and taking Jim Crowism to the Philippines, to Cuba, and other places. They saw, as the writer put it, that the Jim Crow war resulted in a Jim Crow empire determined to oppress dark-skinned people at home and abroad. Black soldiers returning home from Cuba were disarmed, while in the South and left to the mercy of white killers. More of the soldiers were murdered by Southern white policemen than died in the battles in Cuba. How long, ladies and gentlemen, are we going to go through the kind of nonsense we're going through today? And again, we see this business being here. Another letter he refers to here, written by Lewis Douglas, the son of Frederick Douglass, as he talked about black people being hung, in some instances as many as 120 a day, and yet you had black soldiers out here loyal to the United States. What happened? Black men who fought in the Civil War not only helped end slavery, they also, by helping you reunite the country, made it possible for the ex-slave owners to wield more power than they ever could have wielded in the Confederacy they tried to create. So they even grew stronger. So even in the Civil War, the blood of black men helped cement the pillars of post-slavery white supremacy and further the interests of slave owners. The paradox continues. Lewis Douglas, writing the President McKinley knows that brave, loyal black American soldiers who fight and die for their country are hated, despised, and cruelly treated in that section of the country from which this administration accepts dictation and to the taste of which the president undoubtedly caters. He's referring here to the South, of course, and the North. We can't leave them out. The question will be asked, how is it that such promises of liberty and equality are made to Filipinos thousands of miles away, while the action of the administration in protecting dark citizens at home does not even extend to a promise of any attempt to rebuke the outlawry which kills American citizens of African descent for the purpose of gratifying bloodthirstiness and race hatred? How many of these soldiers will be able to walk the streets of Bensonhurst and the other areas of New York after having shed their blood in the sands of Saudi Arabia, ladies and gentlemen? And he goes on to talk about some other things that I wish I had time to talk about, but we'll just make one last quote and end it here. One of the most destructive aspects of this country's racial hiring practices is not only that they force blacks and Latinos into the military in disproportionate numbers, but that those who join have the most going for them. Understand what he's saying here? These are not, the dregs. These are the boys who did it the American way. They stayed in school. They got their education. They are living complete the American dream. They went to college to be somebody, right? To be the best that they could be. They followed our advice. And what do they get for it? The army. And Saudi Arabia. They're the ones who have gone to school, stayed away from drugs and crime, and taken concrete steps to make something of their lives. But you will understand, ladies and gentlemen, that the making of something under white power necessarily involves the making of something by some black men by sacrificing the lives of other black men. I try to tell you that when we talk about black-on-black violence, many of these men are motivated not by criminal desires and twisted motives, as these psychologists try to tell you, that they have some kind of criminal personality. Nonsense. They have the same wishes and desires you have. They are bourgeois criminals. They have bourgeois values. They want the big cars, the big houses, the fine clothes, the same one you went to college for. Come on. Tell the truth. They're motivated by that. They don't have any twisted motives. They have a desire for respect and a desire for status. Understand me? They want to be somebody. But their problem is in the twisted state of imperialism, under the pressure of white supremacy. They're being somebody and they're gaining respect and they're fulfilling the American dream has compelled them to victimize the black community, other black people, and the black children of the world. And therefore, it is not the rehabilitation so much of their motives, even though that needs to be worked on to some degree, and their desires, but the rehabilitation and the total reconstruction of the social political system that gets people who want to turn legitimate desires for respect, for acceptance, for love, for a bit of status into criminal activity and self-destructive behavior. But what will they do? Have you going to school, taking a PhD in clinical psychology, trying to figure out the criminal personality, when it's the criminals who are teaching you the thing in the first place. So that you can, and I teach my class now on the black children at risk. And I said, but I'm not going to teach you about black children. What? No, I'm not teaching you about black children. It's black adults who put black children at risk. Yeah, you want me to give you a whole list of symptoms and behavioral problems in black children. And you want to get a degree in social work and all the other degrees. And you want to sit behind a desk and work one-on-one with them all day long. And when you say one or two, you think you've done something when hundreds and thousands are going over the edge. I'm not going to do it. Because the problem is not in those children. The problem is in the adults. And the problem ultimately is in a political social system. And that the most effective social worker and psychologist is that social worker and psychologist and teacher and whatever other professional you may call it that is involved in massive political change. If you change the political nature of this society and of this world, you save black children by the hundreds and by the thousands, and not one-on-one, and literally treating their symptoms and putting them back out in the war to be destroyed again. And what did he say further? What is the nature of a society that would limit their options to fighting and possibly dying as the only way to make their dreams come true? I state in black-on-black violence that it is not so much the drug addict who needs to be detoxified. It is the pusher who needs to be detoxified of the American dream. For it is his addiction to the American dream that moves him to pushing of the drug and the addicting of other people. Understand? And people then are sold dreams. And so then we are sold the dream to be the best that you can be respected, be the best in your peer group. And how do you do that? You do it then by destroying other people or killing yourself. What social contract says that those who fight for freedom and democracy abroad are not entitled to enjoy it at home? Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Frank. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, because I know our term is right.
We'll take about a good 5 minutes.
We can go right on with it, so in the interest of time.
Okay, well, as Dr. Amos can state, we go right into the question and answer period.
Are there any questions?
Sure,
So I know you got to go to work tomorrow. We got to bring it over there. Time, European time. No questions.
No questions? Go ahead, brother.
Dr. Wilson, how are you, first of all?
Great. Thank you.
In the context of the situation in the Persian Gulf and the status of African people in America, be it which will have a job or just moving into society, I have noticed that people are, this patriotic syndrome that people have played up on the news, people are really quick to be patriotic, and if you mention anything about homelessness, or some of the symptoms that you talk about, some of the problems that this society has, that you can really catch a whole lot of hell and be accused of being unpatriotic and un-American. And in that light, I think the situation might be more dangerous for people who have any type of disagreement, attitude,
But that's part of the problem we have to face. We are in danger as people, and our carrying a low profile and not dealing with the issues is not really going to assure us of any longer lifespan in most instances anyway. So when you're in a situation like we're in, you may as well deal with truth and be forthcoming with it. And of course, one of the problems you have there is a misdefinition of patriotism. And defining patriotism as a blind following of the leader. And wherever the leader tells you to go, that's the way you go. And often it's related often to the misdefining of love. If you love me, you'll do everything I want you to do, that kind of thing. When often the greatest expression of love is in opposition to a wrong act on the part of the one you love. And the greatest expression of love for our country often is to oppose those aims that are incorrect. You see, we should have learned enough from history already as black people, even within this country, leave alone the long history, that this continuing to volunteer for the U.S. Army, this continuing to fight in the hope that after we get through, we can then cash in our checks and say, things are going to get better. We've been through too many of those things to know that this is not going to work. In fact, if you look at the world scene very closely, notice one thing. If you really want to get the most out of a white man fighting, go to war against him. Even if he beats you, he will rebuild your country. You understand? Look at what they're talking about already. Are they talking about already? We must now get money to rebuild Iraq. They demonized them, they bombed them, they hated enemy, and now they're already preparing the American people to pay additional taxes for what? The rebuilding of Iraq. Look at Japan. The Yellow Peril, the Yellow Devil, the Japs, they went through all of that, and they rebuilt it so good, it's now threatening their own economic safety. Look at Germany. Oh, Hitler and his, racism, and Hitler and this and Hitler and that, and what happened? Germany gets what? Rebuilt again. So, if we're just to look at what's going on in history, the best thing we can have with this whitey is a good old-fashioned fight. And he'll just hand us this money and rebuild our whole economy. Our problem is we're sitting around begging. And we're sitting around sacrificing ourselves in war. And I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the day that we decide that we're going to sit and really challenge this man fist for fist and fight for fight, you'll see him changing and bringing and coming around to terms. It is only this approach that we are using now that is adding to our problem, continuing to so-called sacrifice in the hope of doing it. And he knows that we'll do it every time. And it's not, and we have to get out of it. Yes, sir. As far as who? The best program in terms of what? Black leader? Mm-hmm. I don't know whether that kind of judgment is appropriate in the sense that you got some good elements in a number of programs, and of course some programs and approaches can contribute more in a way than others. But I certainly, my own personal bias is one that leans toward the nationalistic people, the Garveys, the Elijah Muhammad, you know, of that type. Because ultimately, from my point of view, we must operate from self-interest. And we must then be concerned about our survival and focus on that survival before anything else. And this is the point of Garvey, this is the point of Elijah Muhammad, of other nationalist leaders. We have had 36 years of the assimilationists. We have had 36 years of what Cruz calls the non-economic liberalism of the NAACP and of the Urban League. Those kind of approaches that centered their attack on our problems around changing a white attitude or around legalistic approaches, while leaving the power to create new attitudes and to rescind the law or not enforcing the law still in the hand of those people. And at the end of those 36 years of following their regime, we see the dire results of that approach. So we don't even have to be theoretical about it. You know, some people I mentioned here Kenneth Clark and his attack now on the Ujamaa school, on the school for black males and so forth, as if now we did not have 36 years to watch us try to do it his way. Okay? Jumping in front of buses, busing children, forcing integration, the whole thing. We've done it your way, Kenneth. And we still have the problem. As a matter of fact, our problems have gotten worse. Now it is time, but he's a typical liberal. Let's try more of the same thing that failed before. It must be that we didn't try harder at the beginning. Yes, sir.
Do you think that black people in America have future?
If we decide we want one.
Do you think the power is in our hands?
Yes, we have the power within our hands. We have tremendous power in this country. Yes, first of all, we have to recognize where it is, and we have to develop the strategies and means of utilizing that power, you see. It is my view that the African American is really the key to the, I don't want to say salvation, but is very, very important to the survival of African people the world over. We play a very, very crucial role here. And we must, and that is why in a sense, the pressure is on us here. And the pressure is on the black male to a very great extent. Let me tell you something, let me just raise a little issue with you now. We talk about this U.S. Army, and to show you now the kind of things we deal with, to kind of complicate it a little bit. On a certain level, if we had the correct consciousness, it might not be all to our disadvantage to have 30 or 40% of the U.S. Army. And to have maybe 50 or more % of the U.S. infantry. division. You understand what I'm saying? In a sense, that is a power for us to say that we got 30%. And we realize when we say 30%, that probably means that you have many units that are 80 or 90%, that are infantry units, you know, and other real heavy units. Now that is a power. Now, if we can appropriately train our young males and get them into this army position with the right head, there's no reason why we couldn't take it. Understand what I'm saying? But we don't have to play it that way. You say, well, ain't no way you're going to get these boys to think that way because the army is going to propagandize them, right? All right. But let's wonder if these boys saw their mothers and fathers being severely brutalized in this country. Would they follow those commanders and white commanders and protect that situation? Or would they not turn against those commanders and against this country? You understand what I'm getting at? Okay? In other words, there are possibilities, and I can't talk about it all on this tape. You understand? But for the strategic thinker, for the person who looks at things objectively, we have a lot of power in this country. We have the power of disruption in this country. This country cannot afford racial instability and conflict. We have that power. We have the power of the dollar. What did I say a while ago about the boycotts? We have not used the tremendous economic power that we have available to us to punish those companies and those systems that do well. Let's look at the economic power, the millions, the billions that we are giving away to other ethnic groups day in and day out. And if we could take that money and spend it with ourselves. And some person was telling me that, well, you know, well, the white suppliers, they are still supplying us and they may cut us off. But you see, we go back to the Japanese solution, right? We know one thing about white men. They will sell their mothers for money. And if they make enough money selling to black suppliers, they'll still sneak it to you, one way or the other. Because look what is going on in Saudi Arabia. White boys are being killed by the weapons sold to what? The Arabs by their fathers. You understand? What did Lenin say? The capitalists will sell you the rope to which to hang it. You understand? So then we can even organize, if we are careful, our economic situation and strategy in such a way that even if they are still the suppliers, we can still manipulate their economic behavior. We can still, and their own suppliers are what? Vulnerable to us as a people. They're not completely protected as well either. We are up and down in this American system. In other words, there are all kinds of possibilities. We talk about what's going on in Africa. There is tremendous investment possibility. We should take advantage now of the Europeans' preoccupation with the Middle East and his preoccupation with Eastern Europe and Russia and Western Europe, and now use this to develop our African continent. Now, if we go and when we go and train our people into politics, we should be training nationalistic politicians to run against these Uncle Tom Rangels and these others, to push them closer to our positions or get ourselves in there so we can open this American continent to the manufacture of African products so that the African manufacturers have a market in which to sell those products. You understand? If we got control of our economy and we had black shopping malls and everything all over this nation and black department stores, we would have a base for black manufacturers in this country, in the Caribbean, in Africa, and so forth, that would add to the prosperity of black people in America and the prosperity of African people across the world and across the diaspora. And there are definite rational ways of doing it. But as I said earlier, if we're spending our time merely concentrating on our pain, on our shame, on how we were done in, and all of this other madness, we never get around to looking at the solution which is right in our face. One more and we're ready to go. Yes, sir.
What would you say if we start with these
If we started releasing what?
Where would you say we start with these strategic encounters?
Number one, I think we should start by creating associations of black males. And we should really begin by studying strategy first. In fact, I've noticed one thing too, and I want to bring this up since this is Black History Month. We must read Black history by all means, but I would also advise you to read imperialistic history. It's very important that we read history from the imperialistic point of view. Because when you read it from the imperialistic point of view, you get a knowledge of the strategies and tactics that can be used to capture and control and to manipulate and do the things that we need to do. I often find then that many of my students are not only then suffering from an absence of knowledge of Black history, there really is an absence of knowledge of imperial technique and methods of gaining and controlling territory. And I think for a while we need to call our groups together to study strategy, to differentiate strategy from tactic, to learn how a group which intends to take power organizes itself and develops itself, and then to develop an appropriate consciousness and organization and relationship between these men and ultimately in the society itself. We then can use various methods because we have to maintain a flexibility. There is no one approach we can use. We will use an approach that is appropriate, which means strategic and tactical analysis is ongoing and constant, you see. And therefore, it is a continuous study, and we will continue to study the situation we are in and continue to study what we want to accomplish and devise the tactics and strategies necessary to get us there. We have to agree, first of all, on the overriding goal as a people. You see, one of the reasons why we have a problem is not that we don't have power. If you read that roster of generals in Saudi Arabia, you will find about 5 or 6 black generals over there, let alone Colin Powell, and let alone the other lower black officers, and of course the soldiers there, right? When you look at black people in this country, you see already a tremendous amount of skills. If we looked at ourselves as a nation, we have more skills and knowledge than many European nations. Just look at those Eastern European nations trying to find out what is capitalism and find out what is a market and how to make accounts and how to do all that. They just all muddle. Look at Russia going into all kinds of confusion in terms of economic development and political development. Look at these countries. We have a great deal going for us already. What's the problem then? We are the 9th or 10th richest nation, right? That's another thing we have. What is the problem then? The problem is the lack of a uniting ideology or a uniting goal. The absence of our thinking of ourselves as a nation within a nation, and then organizing the relationships of all of the people within our group to achieve the goals of that group. And therefore, instead of you just having a skill that's personal to you, it becomes related in a structured way to other people who have skills, and in that sense, you move forward. As I said earlier about the economic system, the basis of an economic system is social relations among people, not money.
That's right.
Not money, but the nature of the social relations that people have. When people decide to relate to each other in a systematic, structured sort of way, it is then that they have economic power. It is not when they just have money. Because if they have money and are merely a bunch of individuals, as we are as people, who are pursuing their own unguided and unthought-through consumer desires, then you have no economic power, even though you have money in your pocket. Now, when you make then that decision, that your first goal is to bring this white man to his knees, and once that decision is made, you then begin to organize exactly what it takes internally and externally to bring that about. It can be brought to a close. But the thinking has to be done first, and the goal has to be chosen first, and the strategy, and now the education of the children. As I'm saying in this current book, if you are not educating these black boys to overthrow white men, you're not engaged in education. There cannot be an African education and an Afrocentric education that does not involve the preparation of black boys to destroy white power. You're playing with yourself if you think so. There cannot be an appropriate education of black people in economics unless it's ultimately to build the black economic power such that it can defend itself against European economic exploitation. And all economics must be taught with that as the central goal. You understand? That is why the education of black boys cannot be a duplicate of European education. In every area and in every discipline is centered on this situation. We are going to end this white man's rulership over us. That's why you don't define what a good course is in terms of the white kids are being taught or anything having to do with that. You will define what a good education is in terms of, will it prepare us to do what? End and break the power of the white man over black people. Thank you kindly. Thank you very much.